Well, thank you for inviting me to talk here. As I said when I introduced myself, my interest has always been in collective community action and activism, but I've not really done very much on emotions until the work recently with IVAR. And looking into it further, I find it quite hard to find much research or theory focusing on emotions in either field. There's a growing interest in ethics in community development, and that's certainly recognising the relationship between emotions and moral values. But until recently, working with emotions, with the exception of the one or two articles which I reference later, has been largely implicit. Can we have the first slide, please, Alina? I'll start with a quote too. So, how do we ever understand social action without understanding emotions? As James Jasper argues, without emotions, there is no social action. The only motivation is group or self-interest. Next slide, please, Alina. Communities are emotional arenas. Many residents look to the places they live to provide safety, connections, and resources. For many, even in today's world, places are an important source of identity. And as Mike said in a presentation to an earlier seminar, rational planning and external interventions often ignore deeply held affect in communities and are sometimes described as ripping out their soul. COVID-19 has demonstrated just how important they can be. And of course, when place doesn't provide these things, it can lead to emotional pain. Next slide, please, Alina. So, understanding emotions is crucial to supporting community action. Emotions help to explain how and why groups form. Jenny Phillimore and her colleagues describe how positive emotions can convert a bunch of like-minded people into a group with purpose. James Jasper writes about how emotions give ideas, ideologies, and even interests their power to motivate. Anger at external interventions, a planning proposal, the closure of a bank branch, a threat to the village post office maybe, will often trigger action. Other triggers may be a sense of grievance in response to neglect or stigmatization, a derogatory article in the local press maybe, or recently, anger at Home Office attempts to remove two asylum seekers in Glasgow. Emotions also help to explain how groups keep going. Paul Hoggett and his colleagues comment that meetings without emotions are incredibly dull. Collective action generates emotions with success, with failure, or simply through social connection. Common purpose, social connection, and conviviality build trust and a glue of solidarity. Groups and campaigns can become more than a means to an end, but important in their own right. But emotions can also explain why groups fail. Disillusion, anger as a result of conflicts and differences within the group, burnout, or simply all passion spent as the group becomes routinized and ceases to have meaning. Sometimes the group may fold due to the loss of a key member who is important to the emotional functioning of the group. Next slide, please, Alina. But all this, of course, creates challenges for those supporting community action who probably sit in the middle of Julian's diagram. Emotions enable effective action, but can also prevent it. The emotion that drives action can create highly charged situations. As the group progresses, differences emerge and conflict can arise. Conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's important to get it out in the open, and it can be really positive to address it. Tuckman's famous model of group dynamics, forming, storming, norming, and performing, highlights the importance of storming for group development, but it does require skill in handling. Passion often drives the involvement of community development workers and others working with communities. Their passion for social justice and anger at social injustice. But workers and leaders may find themselves confronting racism and attitudes to the other, which conflict with the moral principles and values that drive them to action. After all, as the rise of populism and the Brexit vote have demonstrated, one of the paradoxes of community is that it is not them as well as us. Writers on ethical practice stress the importance of empathy and compassion to ethical practice. But how do workers deal with these moral dilemmas, and at what cost? This raises the issue of emotional labour, the requirement to regulate both feelings and the expression of feelings, and the potential for emotional dissonance, a major source, as researchers in the social care field have argued, of burnout, cynicism, and disillusion. Issues of professional boundaries can be fraught. At another level, as Paul Hoggett and his colleagues argue, the focus on outputs and actions these days leaves little space for the emotional and relational work that is so central to development interventions. All in all, we need to know much more about how community workers and activists manage their own and others' emotions in practice, and how they address these challenges. Two contributions seemed particularly important to me in this respect. Next slide, please, Alina. The first is to acknowledge the importance of rituals. I think I'm probably using this in a slightly different way from Julian. Long-standing rituals and recent rituals. Examples of the recent ones, colleagues at IVAR have been evaluating the Eden Project's annual Big Lunch across the UK. Since 1997, the Joe Cox Foundation organised the Great Get Together. And of course, there was the clapping in the early days of the pandemic and the V-Day celebrations later. Next year, we'll probably see community events to celebrate the Queen's Jubilee. As Husteda and King argue, rituals provide stability and can promote a sense of solidarity and cohesion in amongst uncertainty and chaos. They refer to them as providing opportunities for relating, changing, healing, believing, and celebrating. Thus, conviviality also builds the trust that allows for the expression of differences. Social movement scholars highlight the importance of songs and dance, for example, in the civil rights movement. Theories of power highlight the role of discourse. The stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we feel, argues Martha Nussbaum, shape our emotional and ethical reality. Storytelling can play a critical role in building an emotional culture and a sense of belonging. The arts have a vital contribution to make as well. Theatre, literature, poetry, murals speak to the emotions. And sometimes the truth about human emotion can only be conveyed by a work of art. Related to this, if a little more difficult to grasp, is the idea of soul. I talked earlier about how rational planning can rip the soul out of a community. Writing about soul, Peter Westerby stresses the importance of reweaving the social fabric of community, a fabric that he argues has been shredded by the neoliberal capitalist enterprise. He contrasts the superficiality, speed, and individualism of modern life with the depth, connection, slowness, and embodied living that soul requires. Next slide, please, Alina. In neoliberalism, emotions are regarded as an impediment rather than an enabler. As I suggested earlier, there's little room for emotion in target-driven policy and practice. Reality can only be found in things that can be measured and controlled. Neoliberalism focuses on the individual and competition rather than cooperation and the collective. And its view of the world is based on economics. We've seen what a poor deal the humanities are getting under our current government, but humanities are essential to soul. Next slide, please, Alina. This brings me to the question of knowledge and how it is constituted, which is important to us as we go forward. I started life as a researcher in the community development field. I was based in a practice organisation, but I did occasionally bump up against the academic world, asked to write something, invited to a conference, talking to my more academic colleagues. But I came up against a very different culture, and I doubted that what I was doing was at all valid in academic eyes. Much of my work was carrying out evaluations, often participative, concerned with process, formative rather than summative, action research. The dominant academic models that I was then supposed to aspire to seemed, on the other hand, to constitute knowledge as rational, objective, depersonalised, quantitative, and dare I say it, with apologies to a considerable number of my valued colleagues and all of you here, male. Even in the 1990s, I remember getting my first ESRC grant on an ESRC research programme. However, my abiding memory of the first gathering of grantees in this programme was of a very superior, let me say arrogant, bunch of quantitative researchers who completely dismissed our qualitative approaches and our understandings of knowledge. This was quite a while ago, and I'd like to think that it has changed significantly by now. But by then I had already discovered fellow researchers who worked in the same way as I did and shared my uncertainties, as well as feminist researchers who offered an alternative view of values in tune with our understanding of knowledge. Community development practice actually also draws on the work of Paulo Freire and Antonio Gramsci in understanding the power of discourse and hegemonic knowledge, as well as how to challenge it. Alina, next slide, please. The alternative approaches to knowledge and research that spoke far more to my instincts were qualitative, participatory, engaged, and empathetic. Subjectivity was acknowledged and allowed. The personal was political. Feelings mattered. These values have been validated and carried forward by writers such as Martha Nussbaum, breaking open the domain of philosophy. An article on her work introduced me to the concept of the eye of the heart, citing Rumi, the 13th century Persian poet. This eye, he argued, was 70-fold more seeing than the sensible eye. According to Schumacher, it is the eye of the heart that produces insight, he said, as opposed to the power of thought, which he argued produces opinions. You may or may not agree. But what all this underlines, as Westerby argues, is that knowledge is a function of passion as well as reason. So what does this mean for us going forward? I was conscious of a certain amount of dissonance when I read one or two of the rather more impenetrable articles about emotions, but we need both the power of thought and of emotion if we are to take our agenda further. Thank you for listening.